Серпня починаю роботу у медіа-центру України. Мене звати Світлана Чепоренко. Нагадаю, що відтепер ми працюємо в партнерстві з Суспільним в комфортному просторі Урбан 500. А зараз будемо говорити про ринок пального і про те, що зараз відбувається з цінами на пальне і чого.
And what's going on with the prices and what should we expect for during autumn. Joining us in the studio is Serhii Kuiun, fuel market expert. Good morning, Mr. Serhii. Good morning. So the parliament has adopted the legislation on tax hike for excise tax, which is about to grow gradually within 4 years. The growth will start on September 1st in 1 month. So what is your opinion? What are the reasons for such resolution and how it would influence the fuels in the prices in the fuels market? So talking about the reasoning, one of the biggest messages was that we need to get synchronized with the legislation of the European Union on taxation of gas. It has a directive that identifies the key rates, but there were a lot of reasonable comments that probably it's a little bit surprising to adopt some European legislation. Meanwhile, we're not a member of that organization, and that legislation does not cover us. But we all understand what time we live in. This topic has already gained some publicity. I mean, the necessity to liquidate the budget deficit, reaching 500 billion hryvnia, and that was one of the steps aimed at replenishment of state budget. So according to calculations of Cabinet of Ministers and our calculations, we're talking about 2.8 billion hryvnia, including VAT and excise tax. So that's a monthly amount, and only this hike may generate about 30 billion per year. And starting from the 1st January next year, we will come to a following stage that will be equivalent 4 to 5 billion hryvnia per month. I think that is quite a lump sum amount that would allow us to fill the budget. And let me remind you that the state budget is the only source for funding of our defense. Our foreign partners don't fund programs like that. This is why it's our business to fund our army, and everybody has to be ready to pay more for that. So in compliance with the new excise tax, what are the prices for fuel that we should expect in autumn and winter, and what other factors will influence that price? Well, I think that there was a lot more publicity than there will be any consequences. I mean, the excise tax grows like 1 hryvnia per liter, or for diesel 1.5 hryvnia. So we're not going to see any growth, any changes for diesel, I guess, because 1 or 1.5 hryvnia is a daily fluctuation that the consumer usually doesn't even notice. For example, now we're seeing quite a good tendency. Yesterday, the oil price has fallen below $80 per barrel. 1 month ago, it was at the rate of 87. So should have this excise tax started working from August, we wouldn't have seen any changes at all, because the procurement price has fallen, excise tax has grown, and they would compensate each other. I think that probably we would even be able to notice some decrease of prices that we're observing in the internal market. The tax hike is bigger for the liquefied gas. I think that the price is about to grow about 5 hryvnia, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this type of fuel will lose its popularity. It will still be more profitable than gasoline, and for those who have like big figures in their odometers, it will still continue stimulating them for installing those gas engines so it will still have some economy, maybe not so significant. So there will be no tragedy one way or another. So talking about the short-term perspective, I mean, it's clear, but what about the growth that will last about 4 years? Is there a risk for some of the Ukrainians to refuse using their cars due to the growth of the gas prices? Well, I remember before the year 22, I was commenting, and the press, who was curious always, when the prices were growing like 50 kopecks or 1 hryvnia, it was hell. But since 2022, the price has grown almost twice, 27, 25 hryvnias per liter. So we don't observe any decrease of consumption. Well, of course, there is some decrease both in the sectors of gasoline, diesel fuel, and liquefied gas, but it's mostly the consequence of loss of territories, migration of citizens, and basically those who used to drive, they keep consuming the same amount of fuel. So those fluctuations, 1 or 2 hryvnia, and probably if within 4 years the tax burden will grow from 7 to 9 hryvnias, depending on the type of fuel. But again, first of all, it doesn't necessarily mean that it will be reflected in the fuel price, because again, I'm reminding you, our price in the market today is excessive because there is the new supply system in place through the western border, and it means that the logistics is very expensive. The gas tanks, they drive for thousands of kilometers, which is reflected in the price. So as soon as the war is over, as soon as we get access to the big water, to the ports, to the sea, we will be paying less, at least at cost of logistics. It will be minus 3, 4, 5 hryvnias, because we will not need to carry those tanks for thousands of kilometers by roadways. We will bring big tankers to the ports of Odessa, and our logistics will be a lot shorter. So obviously the taxes will grow, but the price would fall one way or another. I cannot say that it will be plus 7 or 10 hryvnia, but again, what the fuel price depends on, it's the global prices for oil. I mean, what will be the price for oil? Nobody knows. Again, exchange rate is something of a definitive factor in Ukraine. Since the beginning of the year, the rate has changed. Hryvnia has lost a little bit. What will be the exchange rate within 4 years? No one's gonna tell now. So there's a lot of factors again, and respectively, we have to understand that higher taxes for fuel is the European practice. It is in place, and eventually the government needs to take a look at the economic condition of the country. If it allows, the program will work. If it will not allow us, the government may initiate either the freezing of this algorithm, I mean of the tax hike, or review of the excise tax. It doesn't mean that it's forever and it's like forever and a day. So let's continue our conversation about import and distribution. What the import is looking like now, what countries do we import fuel from? And you've mentioned that we do not import fuel by sea. However, the armed forces of Ukraine, they mentioned that the sea humanitarian corridor works for example, the agrarians say, if I'm not mistaken, that they export their 90% of their goods by sea. So why don't the fuel suppliers don't use this opportunity? And what are the ways that the importers use? Well, it's only the war risks. For example, the grain is food security, is humanitarian cargo. Everybody understands it's important for the world. And talking about the fuel, Russian consider it a strategic resource. They continue inflicting strikes on our infrastructure. Last week there was another intense attack that resulted, unfortunately, in loss of infrastructure in the tankers. If it's not reported, it doesn't mean that it doesn't happen. Also, there was some intense burning in Bila Tserkva. in June. This is why we still have to live with this problem. It's war risks that don't allow using that corridor for fuel supply. But the market is making it in terms of supply. We have two main directions of import. It's Romania and Poland. So basically it's western and southern corridors. It doesn't necessarily mean that the fuel that is being supplied is manufactured by Polish or Romanian manufacturers. It's mostly about the transit through those countries. It's the use of their ports. And in the ports of those countries, the fuel comes from 15 or 20 countries of the world, including such exotic areas as Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, United States, India, and so on. And on top of those corridors, we have quite an extensive logistic network. It's not only railway. It's the fuel trucks. Our fleet of fuel trucks has grown maybe 4 times since 2022, which allows us respond in a flexible manner to any factor. So when I hear that Hungary or Slovakia may cut the supply of fuel to Ukraine, I mean other directions of supply are way bigger. We will not even feel any restrictions imposed by our neighbors. Is the unique supply system. No one was even believing that it's possible to provide such a big country with stable fuel supply, but we've made it. This market was already tested by a number of factors such as blackouts, and we see that we are able to supply even more than we need. So what is the situation with the shadow fuel market? There is information popping up here and there about some shutdowns of the shadow fuel traders. And in general, does this situation improve this overall situation in the market or not? Well, that market significantly contracted due to some unpredictable factors, not due to the work of law enforcement or legislation or tax administration. It was just the consequence of destruction of those small factories by the Russians. Well, so maybe 24 of them existed before the big war, and half of them was destroyed. One of them was destroyed to the ground, like in the beginning of June in Poltava region. So the number of those factories has decreased. There are problems with the raw material because they have their factors. I mean, the amount of supply is small. It's less than 10% of the market in the gasoline sector, and before the war it accounted for maybe 30-35% of supply. So now the problem is different. There is a problem with failure to pay taxes by their retail chains mostly, and on a quarterly basis I keep publishing the tax ratings, the amounts the key chains are paying, and the difference is 6 to 7 times. It's impossible, right? Because the same people work there at the same salary. Everybody is buying fuel at more or less the same price. Everybody is selling at more or less the same price. So everybody is in the same conditions, but still we observe this difference, and it's quite an unpleasant signal because and finally we see that someone is paying attention to it. In this draft law on tax hike and other activities aimed at replenishing the budget, it's about that tax hike of the military levy, and there is one provision related to fuel station chains that offers advance payments. So basically you have to pay the fixed tax amount in advance without further reimbursements. So basically, you pay at the threshold and then do what you want. So basically, it's a type of administration. It's not about tax hike. It's about the fact that the chains don't pay this tax. I mean, the majority of them, 95%, don't pay the tax in full. However, the tax is added to the price, but it doesn't get to the state budget, and the state says like, oh, okay, we're not gonna play with you. We don't wanna find where you hide the tax, but okay, you get the license for your fuel station. You pay once and then do what you want. And in my opinion, it's a good idea. The only nuance is to correctly identify that monthly payment to make sure it still allows the businesses to work and everybody ends up in more or less equal conditions. And talking about another initiative on part of the parliament promised for the agrarians some exemptions for diesel fuel. Will it allow us to keep the prices to keep the food prices at normal level? Well, it seems to me, first of all, it's my personal impression is that influence of fuel prices and fuel taxes on net cost of agrarian products is a little bit exaggerated. We've made a number of studies, and the fuel component doesn't significantly influence the cost of agricultural products, even in terms of transportation. So with no doubt, it's an exaggeration. And secondly, we have to agree that in Europe there is a practice in place to provide exemptions to agricultural companies. Those are quite significant exemptions because, for example, if we talk about the minimal excise, diesel fuel excise tax rate is 30 euro per 1,000 liters, and in Poland and Lithuania, this amount is 60 euro. So if the government sees, I mean, it's easily calculated, it can be easily calculated. So yes, this practice exists, but what are the threats of it and what should we work on here? First of all, we have to work on making sure that the mechanism for extension of this exemption could guarantee that the fuel will be used by the agricultural companies. So we need to avoid the situation when someone buys that fuel with exemption and then sells them at some retail chains. I mean, the experience that exists in Europe, if I'm not mistaken, is such that first the agricultural companies use the fuel and then they provide the documents for reimbursement to the government. It's based on their sowing area, a number of machines and stuff like that. And I was talking to Polish, Lithuanian traders, and it's the prohibited topic. No one even comes up with an idea to sell that agricultural fuel at retail chains. The punishment is very severe, and I think in our case, half of the market will become agricultural at once, and it will result in losses to the budget. Thank you, Mr. Serhii. Probably some journalists have any questions to our expert. So in case we have no questions, I would like to thank you once again. And let me remind you, we were talking about the fuel market, what's going on with the prices, and what should we wait for further on. And Ukraine Media Center will continue at 13:30, and we will be talking about the potential harvest. Thank you. Stay tuned.